Hey guys, welcome back to Daily Kaylee. Today is a bittersweet episode because it is the last installment of 13 Days of Halloween. Today's episode is extremely interesting if you're into history like me. It is about Josef Mengele, who lived from March 16th, 1911 to February 7th, 1979. If you don't know who Josef is, he was a Nazi officer and a doctor during World War II. He was known as the Angel of Death because he worked at Auschwitz and he performed deadly experiments on prisoners there. He was also a member of the doctors who would select victims to be killed in the gas chambers and was actually also one of the doctors who administered the gas. He was, luckily for him, transferred from Auschwitz to Gross-Rosen concentration camp on January 17, 1945, which was 10 days before the arrival of Soviet forces at Auschwitz to liberate the camp. Before the war, Josef received doctorate degrees in anthropology and medicine. He began his career as a researcher. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and became an officer in 1938. He was assigned as a battalion medical officer at the start of World War II, and then he was transferred to concentration camps in early 1943, and that's when he was assigned to Auschwitz. Because of his medical interest, he saw this opportunity as one where he could conduct genetic research on human subjects. His experiments focused mainly on twins, and he had no regard for the health or safety of these victims. After the war, he fled to South America. He sailed to Argentina in July of 1949, and he was assisted by a network of former Nazi officers. He initially lived in Argentina, and then he fled again in 1959 to Brazil. All this time, he was being sought after by West Germany, Israel, and even Nazi hunters who wanted to bring him to trial. He somehow eluded being captured, and he actually drowned in 1975 because he suffered a stroke while swimming off of the coast of Bertioga, and he was buried under the false name of Wolfgang Gerhard. However, his remains were positively identified by forensic examination in 1985. So he eluded his arrest for 40 years. While he was a young child, he took a huge interest in music, art, and skiing. He was extremely successful in school, and he graduated high school in April of 1930 and then went on to study philosophy in Munich. This is where the headquarters of the Nazi Party were located. The following year, 1931, he joined a group by the name of Der Stahlhelm, which was a paramilitary organization that was absorbed into the Nazi Party. In 1935, he earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of Munich, and in January of 1937, he joined the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene. And this is where he worked for a doctor by the name of Ottmar Freyer von Verschuer, who was a German geneticist and had a particular interest in researching twins. As a medical assistant, Josef focused on the genetic factors that resulted in a cleft lip and palate or a cleft chin. He got a doctorate in medicine from the University of Frankfurt in 1938, and both of his degrees, however, were revoked by the universities in the 60s because of what happened to Auschwitz. Josef married a woman by the name of Irene Schonbein, who he met while working as a medical resident. They married on July 28, 1939, and in 1944, their only son, Rolf, was born. Josef Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937, and he received basic training in 1938. In 1940, he was finally called up for service in the Nazi armed forces, and this was just right before the outbreak of World War II. He then volunteered for medical service, and he was a medical reserve battalion until November of 1940. In June of 1941, he was assigned to serve in Ukraine, and he was awarded the Iron Cross because he rescued 2 German soldiers from a burning tank. He was declared unfit for further active service until the middle of 1942 because he was severely wounded in action. After his recovery, he was transferred to Nazi headquarters, and he resumed association with the doctor that he used to work for, who was now a director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. Auschwitz, as most of us know, it was intended to originally house slave laborers, but then it became a labor and extermination camp. They were told to line up, and there were 2 lines. One line were people that were considered able to work, and the other were those that were unfit for labor. The line of those that were unfit for labor were immediately put into the gas chambers. 3/4 of the total number that arrived were selected to die, and they were almost all children, women with small children, pregnant women, or elderly people. In early 1943, Josef applied to transfer to the concentration camp service. His application was accepted, and he was sent to Auschwitz. He was given the position of chief physician, and he was basically the doctor in charge. At Auschwitz, they did not administer treatment to the inmates, but they would supervise the activities of inmate doctors who were forced to work in medical service at the camp. Part of his job was to order any prisoners that did not recover after 2 weeks to be sent to the gas chambers. He was also in charge of carrying out selections of those to be put in the gas chamber. And even when he was not assigned to do this, he chose to do this. He used this as a cover for finding subjects for his experiments. Most of the other Nazi doctors thought that this was a very stressful and unpleasant task, but he wanted to do this. There was an outbreak of a disease called pneuma, which was a bacterial disease of the nose and face, and it struck the camp in 1943. Josef used this to initiate a study to determine the cause of the disease and try to develop a treatment. He did this with the assistance of a prisoner by the name of Bertold Epstein, who was a Jewish pediatrician and a professor at Prague University. The patients were isolated in a separate room, and several of the children that had the disease were killed so that their heads and organs could be sent to the Nazi Medical Academy to be studied, pretty much. The research was still going on when the camp was liberated and the remaining occupants were killed in 1944. A typhus epidemic broke out in the women's camp, and he sent 600 women to their deaths in the gas chambers so that he could clear out the room, pretty much. The building was cleaned and disinfected, and then the ones in the neighboring building were bathed, given new clothing, all of that jazz, and then moved to a new clean block of barracks. He used Auschwitz as an opportunity to study genetic research and human experimentation. He did not care if the patient survived, if they were in pain, if it was a safe procedure. He was using them as a test subject. He was extremely interested in identical twins, people that had two different colored eyes, dwarfs, and people with physical abnormalities. He would ship specimens to the doctor that he worked for in Frankfurt, and they would collaborate on diagnosis, shit like that. Basically, what his twin research was for. He wanted to prove that heredity was supreme over environment, because the Nazis believed that the Aryan race was superior because of their genetics, and this study was somehow going to prove that for him. He also wanted to study twins to see if he could increase the reproduction rate of the German race, because he wanted to improve the chances of what he called racially desirable people of having twins. His research subjects, even though he treated them horribly with his experiments, they were better fed and better housed than any other prisoners. And because of him, they were temporarily spared from execution in the gas chambers. They lived in their own barracks, and they were provided with much better food, much better living conditions. And he would call himself Uncle Mengele and offer them sweets. It's like he wanted them to like him and look up to him, respect him, even though he knew that he was literally personally responsible for their deaths. Not only did he kill through his experiments, he would also kill people by lethal injection, shootings, and beatings. In a book in 1986 that was written about someone's time at Auschwitz, Mengele was described as sadistic, lacking empathy, and extremely anti-Semitic. His son Rolf later claimed that his father had shown no remorse for his wartime activities. A former Auschwitz inmate doctor said that he was capable of being so kind to the children, to have them become fond of him, to bring them sugar, to think of small details in their daily lives, and to do things we genuinely would admire. And then next to that, the crematoria smoke and these children, tomorrow or in half hour, he is going to send them there. Well, that is where the anomaly lay. The twins that he would experiment on were subjected to weekly examinations and measurements of their physical attributes, either by Mengele or one of his assistants. The experiments that he performed on these twins included unnecessary amputation of their limbs, intentionally infecting one twin with typhus or another disease, and transfusing the blood of one twin into another. Many of their victims died undergoing these procedures, especially being fucking amputated and injected with these viruses. And those who survived the experiments were sometimes killed on purpose, and their bodies were dissected once Mengele no longer had use for them. Reports show that on one occasion, Mengele personally killed 14 twins in one night because he injected their hearts with chloroform. If one twin died from disease, he would kill the other twin because he wanted post-mortem reports to show that twins were affected the same way. For some reason, he wanted that to be the outcome of all of his experiments. Some of his experiments included trying to change eye color by injecting chemicals into the eyes. And then he would kill people that had two different colored eyes so that the eyes could be removed and sent to Berlin to be studied by doctors. His experiments on dwarfs and people with physical abnormalities included taking physical measurements, drawing blood, extracting healthy teeth, and treatment with unnecessary drugs and x-rays. Most of his victims were dispatched to the gas chambers after about 2 weeks, and their skeletons were sent back to Berlin to be further analyzed. Mengele sought out pregnant women as well, so that he could perform experiments before he sent them to the gas chambers. He would perform surgery without anesthesia. He would remove hearts and stomachs of his victims. In 2009, a survivor by the name of Yitzhak Gannon reported that Mengele had removed his kidney without anesthesia, and he was forced to return to work without painkillers. Another witness by the name of Vera Alexander described how Josef Mengele had sewed 2 Romani twins together back to back to attempt to create conjoined twins, and both children died of gangrene after several days of suffering. On January 17th, 1945, Mengele and several other Auschwitz doctors were transferred to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. He took 2 boxes of specimens with him and the records of his experiments at Auschwitz. Most of the camp medical records had been destroyed by the Nazi officers by the time that Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th. Mengele left Gross-Rosen on February 18th, a week before the Soviets arrived there, and he traveled to Czechoslovakia. He temporarily trusted his incriminating documents to a nurse that he had struck up a relationship with. After he gave these documents to her, he and his unit hurried west to avoid being captured by the Soviets, but then they were taken by prisoners of war by the Americans in June 1945. Although he was registered under his own name, he was not identified as being on the list of major war criminals because there was just so many disorganized documents. He also did not have the swastika tattoo that many of his other fellow officers had. Somehow, he was released at the end of July because he had false papers under the name Fritz Ullman. After months on the run, he went back to the Soviet-occupied area to recover his Auschwitz records from the nurse. He eventually escaped to Germany on April 17, 1949, because he was convinced that being captured would mean a trial and a death sentence. And he was probably right. With the assistance of former Nazi members that he was close to, he traveled to Genoa and he obtained a passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross under the alias Helmut Gregor, and that is when he sailed to Argentina in July of 1949. His wife refused to go with him, as would I, and they divorced in 1954. While being in Argentina, there were records released after his death in 1992 that indicate he may have practiced medicine without a license, including performing abortions. He obtained a copy of his birth certificate through the West German Embassy in 1956, and he was issued an Argentine foreign residence permit under his real name. He used this document to obtain a West German passport, which also used his real name, and he embarked on a trip to Europe. He met up with his son Rolf, and at the time Rolf was told that Josef was actually his Uncle Fritz. He also went with his widowed sister-in-law Martha for a ski holiday in Switzerland. When he returned to Argentina in September of 1956, Mengele began living under his real name. Martha and her son Karl Heinz went to Argentina a month after Josef left, and they all three began living together. Josef and Martha were married in 1958 while on holiday in Uruguay, and they bought a house in Argentina. Mengele became part owner of Fadro Farm, which is a pharmaceutical company. However, in 1958, Mengele was questioned on suspicion of practicing medicine without a license when a teenage girl died after an abortion, but he was released without a charge. He knew that if this story came out, this would lead to his Nazi background and his wartime activities being discovered. So he took an extended business trip to Paraguay, and he was granted citizenship there in 1959 under the name Jose Mengele. He returned to Argentina several times for business reasons and to visit his family. And Martha and Karl lived in a boarding house in the city until December 1960 when they went back to Germany. Mengele's name was mentioned several times during the Nuremberg trials, which happened in the mid-1940s, but the Allied forces believed that he was probably already dead. His wife and his family in Germany also alleged that he had died. They told everyone he was dead. They hadn't heard from him. However, while working in West Germany, Nazi hunters Simon Wiesenthal and Hermann Langben collected information from witnesses about Mengele's wartime activities. When they were searching public records, Langben discovered that Mengele had filed divorce papers and had listed an address in Argentina. He and Wiesenthal pressured the West German authorities into starting extradition proceedings, and an arrest warrant was drawn up on June 5th, 1959. Argentina initially refused to extradite Josef because He was no longer living at the address given on the documents. By the time the extradition was approved on June 30th, Mengele had already fled to Paraguay, and he was already living on a farm outside of Argentina. In 1971, Josef obtained the identification card of a man by the name of Wolfgang Gerhard while he was seeking medical treatment. He used this alias until he died. While visiting friends on February 7th, 1979, on the coastal resort of Bertioga, which is in Brazil if you don't know, he suffered a stroke while swimming and he drowned. He was then buried in Embu, Brazil, under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. Sightings of Josef were being reported all over the world. And so many people were giving out false information, false sightings. There was crazy, crazy things going on. There were even things that happened in 1978 in Paraguay, and this was 18 years after he had left the country. There were even stories as late as 1985 that Mengele was still alive, and this was 6 years after he was dead. On May 31st, 1985, the West German prosecutor's office received a report, and police raided the house of a man by the name of Hans Sedlmayr, who was a lifelong friend of Mengele, and he was actually a sales manager of his family's firm. They found a coded address book and copies of letters sent to and received from Mengele. Among the papers was a letter from Wolfram Bossert, notifying Sedlmayr of Mengele's death. They flew to Brazil, interrogated Wolfram Bossert and his family, and they revealed the location of Mengele's grave. The remains were exhumed on June 6, 1985, and his identification was matched in 1992. That is the end of The Angel of Death, and I hope you enjoyed this entire series of 13 Days of Halloween. I really enjoyed recording this. I've worked so hard the past couple of weeks to put out new content for you guys every other day, and it's felt so rewarding. I hope you guys continue to listen to Daily Kaylee. Like this page on Facebook if you haven't already. Follow me on Instagram at Daily Kaylee Podcast. There will be more in the near future. Bye, guys.